Hey guys, in today's lecture we'll be dealing with transformational generative grammar and the major tenets of transformational generative grammar. The previous lecture was an introductory lecture on the concept of transformational generative grammar, in which we studied some of the major concepts behind transformational generative grammar. Today we'll be looking at the underlying principles of transformational generative grammar. Now, before moving on with the major tenets of transformational generative grammar, let me give you a quick recap on how it came into being. Transformational generative grammar is one of the most influential of the modern linguistic theories. Introduced through Noam Chomsky's syntactic structures, the theory was revolutionary, but some of its basic concepts were already there in the existing theories. So, though transformational generative grammar can be considered as a revolutionary theory, its seeds were already there in some of the earlier linguistic theories like phrase structure grammar, scale and category, tag mimics, stratificational grammar, etc. So, a new version of transformational generative grammar was presented by Noam Chomsky in his book Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, which was published in the year 1965. In this book, he questioned some of the basic principles of the structural approach. Now, we shall discuss some of the important points that he discussed in the aspects of the theory of syntax, which mark this approach as an advancement over the earlier ones. So, just like your phones, which will come up with a new version every year, transformational generative grammar can be considered as a new version of all the existing linguistic theories, and it was a far advanced version. So there are some underlying principles which govern this advanced version of grammar, and in today's lecture we will be dealing with such underlying principles. So without further ado, let's begin our lecture. Tenets of TG grammar are the basic principles which govern transformational generative grammar. Now, there is a mental reality underlying linguistic behavior. Linguistic behavior is not just a habit formation like any other behavior. Behavioral means something which we acquire as a matter of habit. If a person is an introvert, it's its habit, right from the beginning, he will be secluded, or he will like to be isolated from the group. He would like to think on his own. If a person is an extrovert, he would go out there and get it, right? So, human behavior in a way develops through habit formation. But language is not mere habit formation. It cannot be just reduced to a habit formation, something that you pick up. Like it is a kind of a behavior, it is a habit, but it cannot be just reduced to a form of habit formation, because even a second language speaker might be able to create new works of art using a foreign language, right? We have Indian English authors who are able to create masterpieces using the English language, though their mother tongue was not English. We had a famous poet in Malayalam who wrote in English as well, and she wrote in one of her poems that I speak 3 languages, write in 2, dream in 1. You know her. It is none other than Kamala Das. So she said that I speak 3 languages being Malayalam, English and Bengali for that matter. Write in 2, meaning English and Malayalam, and dream in 1. the one universal language in which we all dream. That's what she said. So language has got a creative ability, right? Even a foreign language learner might be able to create works of art using language. So language is not just a mere habit formation. It is a mental reality. There is a mental reality underlying linguistic behavior. There are some mental realities that underlie linguistic behavior. That's why in one of the earlier lecture, I said that if you go through intense trauma, you may go through a phase of aphasia where you won't be able to speak much. So it is closely related with our mental reality. Now, the description of language is primarily concerned with the speaker's knowledge for his language, that is, his linguistic competence rather than performance. Now, we shall discuss linguistic competence and performance and lang and parole in another lecture, a short lecture which follows this. So the major thing is that the description of a language is primarily concerned with the speaker's knowledge for his language. So what the speaker knows is of greater importance. A person's linguistic competence has greater importance than performance. His overall knowledge of the language is important. A speaker's individual knowledge of the language is important. So linguistic competence is the knowledge possessed by the native speakers of a language. Now, it is different from linguistic performance, which is the way a language system is used for communication. So, the way in which a language system is used for communication, all the rules that pertain to language would denote linguistic performance. But linguistic competence means it is the individual speaker's ability to use language, right? So, the mere description of language, the description of language is primarily concerned with the speaker's knowledge for his language, his linguistic competence rather than on performance. That is what Noam Chomsky said. Now, grammar of a language is not a mere classification of the actual sentences produced by the native speaker, but a system of rules and principles internalized by the native speaker for his exposure to the language. So, grammar of a language is not a mere classification of actual sentences produced by the native speakers, but a system of rules and principles internalized by the native speaker from his exposure to the language. That is what the structuralist said, and that is what Noam Chomsky too said. That is, it is not a mere classification. Even when we learn grammar as though it is a classification, right? Right from parts of speech, it's all about classification of different grammatical category, and it is always based on sentences and actual sentences which are produced by the native speakers. We always look up at the BBC English or the RP as the standard variety of English, and we would try to mimic them, and we would try to make our rules of grammar based on it, and then we try to write our language based on the native speaker's language. That's what we do in grammar. But the structuralist grammarians were against this, and they realized that language is a system of rules which is internalized by the native speaker. Language is something that a native speaker acquires on his own. It is internalized by the native speaker. It is not like he learns language through classification. When you learned Malayalam, it was not like you learned namam and kriya, karmam, etc. Right? Instead, you started speaking in the language. You started picking up the language from your parents, from your grandparents, and from the people around you. And suddenly, you started speaking in it. You internalize the rules, right? Ningal സ്വയം internalize ചെയ്തു rules. So, you internalize the rules And it happened because of the native speaker's exposure to the language, because more people speak in a particular language and you're exposed to it, so automatically you begin to speak in that language. That's what happens in language. So the modern day structural grammarians always focused on this aspect of language, and they considered language acquisition as more than a habit formation. It is an internalized process. It happens when we listen to utterances, and then it is an internalized, we internalize the principles governing the language and then we speak. It's not like we learn the language and the classification and then we try to speak, right? So even in primary classes, in the olden days, they used to ask, the teachers used to first recite the alphabets, right? You were asked to recite the ABCs and then you were asked to write. So that's what happened. First you were asked to recite, then you were asked to write, then you were asked to read. From whatever that you wrote, you were asked to read. And that's how it went. But when you are acquiring language, and then years later you might have listened to a native speaker and then you might have picked up some language from the native speaker. The English that you see in the series or the web series that you watch, so from them you picked up the original BBC English, and it was later on that you learned how to speak properly, right? That's what we normally do. We in India, or for that matter for any foreign language learner, this is what happens. First they recite the alphabets, so they are learning the classifications, right? First they recite the alphabets, then they write it, then they read it, and then they hear it. But for the native speaker, it happens the other way around. For us, when we learn Malayalam, we first hear, then we speak, then we learn to write and read simultaneously. That's what happens. So this process is not there in the case of a native speaker. In the case of a person who learns English as a foreign language, EFL. So a native speaker internalizes the rules of language, and he internalizes the rules of language through his constant exposure to language. And this is a concept that the structural grammarians gave more importance to, right? I hope that it was clear. Now, any speaker of a language can produce and comprehend novel utterances created out of the principles and rules internalized by them. So, any speaker of a language can produce and comprehend new utterances created out of the principles and rules internalized by him. So there are some principles and rules that are internalized by him, and from them any speaker can come up with a new utterance, a novel utterance, right? For example, a few years before, there was no such thing as selfie, right? Selfie as a term, I think, was not there in the 90s. It came somewhere in the mid 2000s. That's when the word selfie first came into being. So any speaker of language can produce, so there is an element of creativity here. Any speaker of language can produce and comprehend novel, means new utterances created out of the principles and rules internalized by him. So these new utterances will be created by the rules and principles which were internalized by him. Right. So any person can come up with a new utterance. A grammar is a finite set of rules which generates and describes an infinite number of all and only possible sentences in a language. So what should grammar be like? Grammar is a finite set of rules. Finite means it's not infinite. It is a set of rules. A grammar is a finite set of rules which generates and describes infinite number of all and possible sentences. So in grammar there is only a finite set of rules. The rules in grammar are very limited in number. Even when we learned TG grammar, we learned about only a few transformations, right? For us to study, there are only a few transformations, but other than that we learned about active passive transformation, then we learned about negation or negative transformation, then we learned about interrogative transformation, where you turn a declarative sentence into an interrogative sentence. Then there is one more transformation which I forgot to mention in the previous lecture, which is known as affix switch or affixation or affix transformation rule. So these are some of the rules. These are a finite set of rules which generates, that is, it has the capability to create, it has the capability to generate and describe infinite number of all and possible and all and only possible sentences in language. So using the limited finite number of rules, we are able to create infinite numbers of all and only possible sentences in a language. We are able to define, we are able to describe, we are able to create all possible sentences in a language and the only possible sentences in a language. We are not creating nonsensical sentences here. We are creating sentences which make sense. That's why we say that only possible sentences. We are able to create all infinite number of all and possible sentences in a language using a finite set of rules. Using a limited set of rules, we are able to create infinite number of all and only possible sentences in a language. TG grammar aimed at predicting the potential sentences of a language as well. So what TG grammar does is that using a finite, a limited set of rules, it describes and it creates infinite set of all possible sentences and only possible sentences in a language. And TG grammar is aimed at predicting the potential sentences of a language as well. So what are the potential sentences that we can create from a particular sentence? That is what the transformative generative grammarians do. When they come up with a language, they will think about all the positive utterances that can be created using a particular utterance. An example would be, in the previous lecture, we said about the sentence, John saw Mary. So John saw Mary was a kernel sentence, and from the kernel sentence, John saw Mary, we were able to create sentences like, did John see Mary, which was an interrogative sentence. Then, didn't John see Mary, which was a negative interrogative sentence. So, using a finite set of rules, you are able to create infinite possible sentences, or infinite or the only possible sentences in a language using TG grammar. So TG grammar is aimed at predicting the potential sentences of a language as well. So when you get a sentence like John saw Mary, TG grammarians or transformational generative grammar, the people who use transformational generative grammar, linguists, would come up with sentences like, did John see Mary or didn't John see Mary, and they will be able to describe each of these utterances as well. Now, traditional grammar is generative in the sense that the output is not the same as the input. So, in PS grammar or phrase structure grammar, we saw that the output is somewhat the same as the input. That's what one of you asked me the same question. What is the need of explaining it thus? Because the output is same as the input, right? But in transformational generative grammar, we are able to generate a new output. So TG grammar is generative in the sense that the output is not the same as the input. The output is generated making use of a system of rules abstracted from the input. So the new output is generated using a system of rules which is abstracted, which we apply to the input. So we apply a system of rules to the input and then we get the output. So transformational generative grammar is generative in the sense that the output is different from the input, or the output is not as the same as the input. Moving on, The distinction between the surface structure SS, the structure of actual utterances, and the deep structure means meaning, is crucial for linguistic description. So whenever we describe language, the difference or the distinction between the surface structure and the deep structure must be brought to the front. But the previous grammars were not able to do that. The previous grammarians were not able to do that. But in transformational generative grammar, we are able to show the difference between the surface structure, which is the structure of the actual utterance, and the deep structure, which is the meaning of the utterance. Now, this is a very crucial point which needs to be learned in detail. Now, let's take two sentences. John is easy to please and John is eager to please. So, in the previous classes, I said that these two sentences have the same structure according to IC analysis, right? John is eager to please and John is easy to please. So there is a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and then there is a noun, verb, and then there is a complement. So the same applies to John is eager to please as well. John is easy to please and John is eager to please are similar when we analyze the structure using IC analysis. But TJ grammar will show how they have two different deep structure, because on the surface level John is easy to please and John is eager to please are similar, but on a deeper level in the deep structure it is different, and TJ grammar will help us show this difference. So the deep structure reflects the basic regularities in a language, the stateable items in terms of finite number of rules. So the deep structure will show the basic regularities in a language, the stateable items of finite number of rules. So deep structure will always be based on the finite number of rules, and it will state all the individual elements. But the surface structure has a number of irregularities which can be shown as derived from the deep structure through the application of transformational rules. So in the previous lecture I showed how we apply transformational rules to the deep structure to arrive at the surface structure. That's how we do, right? We apply T rules to the deep structure. So the deep structure would just show the basic irregularities of a language. It would show the stateable items like noun, verb, complement, or noun, verb, adjective, adverb. Like that, it would show the basic complements, whether it be a phrase or whether it be a category. It will show the basic components of that particular sentence using a finite number of rules. But the surface structure has a number of irregularities which can be shown as being derived from the deep structure through the application of transformational rules. So the surface structure is always derived from the deep structure by the application of transformational rules. The surface structure is always derived from the deep structure by the application of transformational rules. Now moving on to the next point, TJ grammar comprises three components: syntactic, semantic, and phonological. So TJ grammar consists of three components: syntactic, semantic, and phonological. Among them, the central part is that of the syntactic components, because the syntactic components, the word order, it generates the deep structure which undergoes certain transformation, and the transformed surface structure get a phonetic representation from the phonological components and a semantic representation from the semantic components and become a sentence. So this is what happens in transformational generative grammar. Transformational generative grammar has three components. The major central component is that of syntactic component, which is based on word order. Now the syntactic component generates the deep structure. That is the phrase structure rules. Using the phrase structure rules, a modified form of phrase structure rules, we are able to derive a deep structure which comprises the syntactic component. Now to this syntactic component, we can apply transformations, we can apply T rules, and we can produce transforms. Okay, or the surface structure, we can produce transformed. The transformed surface structure get phonetic representation as well. So we will be able to phonologically represent the transformed surface structure. That's what happens first. We will be able to phonetically represent the transformed surface structure, and in this case we will be introducing the affix, switch, etc., which are obligatory rules, right? So from the transformed surface structure, we get the phonetic representation or the phonological representation, how we need to pronounce such words, and we get the semantic representation as well, and which is, it add semantic components to it and makes it a meaningful utterance. So it has to be made meaningful, right? So in the second case, we make it meaningful by adding the semantic components too. So that is again reiterated in the next para. The central part, the syntactic component, generates deep structure which undergoes certain transformations, and the transformed surface structure get phonetic representation from the phonological component and semantic representation. Semantic means relating to meaning, and it gets semantic representation from the semantic components, and then it becomes the sentence. So it has to make sense, right? That's why it has three set of components: syntactic, which creates the deep structure, and to this deep structure we apply the transformation rules and we get transformed surface structure, and to this transformed surface structure we can add the phonological components and create a phonetic representation, and to this we can add the semantic components, and then we can create a semantic representation as well. And then when we add semantic component, it becomes a comprehensible sentence, a sentence that we can understand. Now the last and final tenet of transformational generative grammar is that structural grammar described observed data, whereas transformational generative grammar uses evaluation procedures to evaluate alternative grammars and select the best to explain the existing data and to predict potential data. That's what transformational generative grammar does. So in that way, transformational generative grammar stands apart from structural grammar. Though it came from structural grammar, though it has its roots on structural grammar, it was different from structural grammar too. It was a revolutionary concept. Okay, so it in a way broke the idea of structural grammar. Structural grammar just described and observed data. Whatever that they saw, they described. They try to describe a person's linguistic utterances. That's what the structural grammarians did. But transformational generative grammar uses evaluation procedures to evaluate alternate grammars. So they will be evaluating all the alternate grammars that are already existing. They will evaluate all the alternative existing grammars and select the best grammar to explain the existing data as well as to predict the possible potential data. So using transformational generative grammar, we are also able to generate sentences, right? So it describes the already existing data, it explains the already existing data, as well as it can predict potential data. It can predict new utterances as well, which makes it a revolutionary concept, and it stands poles apart from the structural grammar. Though transformative generative grammar has its rules on structural grammar, it stands poles apart from structural grammar because of this revolutionary concept of explaining the existing data as well as predicting the potential data. So I hope that it was clear. Now in 1957, when Chomsky introduced the concept of transformational generative grammar, he organized transformational generative grammar into three components: the base component, the transformational component, and the morphophonemic component. So the base component is also known as the PS component. Now, when it comes to transformational generative grammar, Chomsky did modify the PS rules to a certain extent. Okay, so he did modify the PS rules and the PS structure. So the base component is the PS component. And then he added the transformational component, which is the T rules and the transforms. Then there is the transformational component, and then there is the morphophonemic components. After doing the transformation, we will be looking at the morphemes. We will be looking at the words at the level of morphemes. So after transforming the sentence, after applying passivation, passive transformation or negative transformation or negation, or T passive, as we say, passive transformation is also known as T passive, or after doing negation transformation, or after doing affix switches. This is what we do, because when it comes to so after doing the transformational component, that is after converting the sentence from an assertive sentence to a negative sentence, then from a positive sentence to a negative sentence, that is what we call assertive to negative, right? Then from a declarative to interrogative, from an active to passive sentence, this is what happens in transformational component. After that, we will be adding the affixes and prefixes, that is what we say as morphophonemic components. So we will be adding the affix switch as well as affix switch, that's what we say, affixation transformation will be done. So in 3 levels TG grammar is organized. One is at the level of base component, which is also known as PS component. Then we have the transformational component, in which we introduce the T rules of transformations, and then we have the morphophonemic components, in which we introduced the morphemes as well as phonemes into the sentence, into the surface structure, and then we create the sentence as such. This is what happens in transformational generative grammar. Now in another lecture, I will show you how to do transformational generative analysis and how to come up with, how to generate a terminal string using transformational generative grammar. For the time being, this is it. Thank you for listening. If you have any doubts, do ask me. Thank you. Take care.